didn't know what was happening. I was so exhausted, you know.
Yeah.
It was like a, what do you call those things? Nervous breakdown or whatever.
He looked me square in the eyes and said, "I won't be here." And I said, "What do you won't be here?" He says, "It's because I won't be in my body, I'll be dead."
What really happened with Jimi Hendrix before his death? Why did his band members hate him? Was there more going on behind the scenes than we knew? Jimi was one of the most famous musicians in the world. So why was his life filled with dark secrets?
But they had checked afterwards through a post-mortem and they traced no drugs whatsoever otherwise. And neither did they find any needle marks, which you would have if you put heroin in your body.
What caused his band to turn against him? Let's dive into the shocking truths about Jimi Hendrix and his final years.
The shyest person I had ever seen in my entire life, even to this day.
Jimi, born as Johnny Allen Hendrix in Seattle, Washington during World War II. His father, Al Hendrix, and mother, Lucille, had just gotten married the same year. But only 3 days after their wedding, Al was drafted into the Army. Lucille was still pregnant with Johnny when Al left. He was stationed far away from Seattle, so he wasn't able to visit his wife during or after the birth. Even though Al asked for leave to be with Lucille, his request was turned down. To make matters worse, Al was put in the stockade, military jail, for trying to leave his post. He spent over a month there without even being charged with anything. While Al was away, Johnny was taken care of by his mother's mother, Clarice. Lucille had trouble staying in contact with Al, and Johnny was passed between several different women for care. After Al finally came home from the Army in 1945, he met his son for the first time when Johnny was 3 years old. Al didn't like the name Johnny Allen, thinking it might be connected to a man Lucille had been with while he was gone. So he changed his son's name to James Marshall Hendrix.
He basically had one gray sweater and shoes, but his shoes would always be turned on the side because when you walk on your shoes so long on one side, they start leaning because the heel would slant, and so he had a hard time with shoes.
James, as he was now called, didn't have the happiest childhood. His parents' marriage was not a good one. Al had even tried to divorce Lucille while he was away at war, but after he came back, he decided to try and make the marriage work. However, things only got worse. Al and Lucille fought often, especially when they had been drinking. These fights would be long and sometimes very loud, and they would hurt James and his younger brother, Leon. Leon later said that Al never hit Lucille, but Lucille had a short temper when she drank. She would get angry and throw things at Al during these fights. James and Leon became so used to their parents fighting that they would hide in a closet when things got bad, hoping the fights would stop. Eventually, in 1951, Lucille left the family and Al pushed for a divorce. He gained full custody of James and Leon. Not long after, the youngest brother, Joe, was put into foster care. James and his brothers were separated and wouldn't live together again for many years.
Jimi Hendrix could play that rock and roll. I used to be singing rock and roll, getting woo, 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 be gone. He had that thing just romping and tumping all up under my toes.
Hendrix's love for music started when he was just a little kid. As a young boy in grade school, he carried around a broomstick and pretended it was a guitar. His dad once said that Jimi would sit at the end of his bed, strumming the broom as if he was playing a real guitar. But one day, Jimi found something even better, a real ukulele. It was an old, beat-up instrument with only one string. Jimi discovered it while helping his dad clean someone's house. Even though it only had one string, Jimi taught himself to play by ear, copying the songs he loved, like Elvis Presley's Hound Dog. When Jimi turned 15, he finally got his first real guitar. But there was one problem. It was a right-handed guitar and Jimi was left-handed. Instead of giving up, Jimi decided to play the guitar upside down. This was a unique style he kept for the rest of his career. In 1958, something very sad happened in Jimi's life. His mother, Lucille, passed away. She had been very sick, and Jimi and his brother, Leon, were heartbroken. They were especially hurt because their father wouldn't let them go to her funeral. This left a deep wound in Jimi's heart that never healed. He began to pour all his pain and sadness into music. He would spend hours playing his guitar, teaching himself the blues songs he loved. For the first time in his life, Jimi found something that made him feel good about himself: music.
He give it all to you. And that's what you want. You want it all or none. But Jimi had this perseverance to go on. He didn't mind looking freaky.
At first, Jimi's journey as a musician was not easy. He started out playing for other bands, just as a hired guitarist. His first performance was in the basement of a synagogue in Seattle, but it didn't last long. Jimi's wild stage moves got him kicked out before the show even ended. He later joined a band called the Velvetones, but his acoustic guitar didn't make enough sound to compete with the rest of the band. So in 1959, Jimi's dad finally bought him an electric guitar, a white Supro Ozark, which helped him stand out. Jimi's band, the Velvetones, didn't get paid, but they played for a while before changing names to the Rocking Teens, then the Rocking Kings, and finally Thomas and the Tomcats. But just as Jimi was starting to make a name for himself, trouble struck. In 1961, at the age of 18, he was arrested for joyriding. Jimi had to choose between going to prison or joining the U.S. Army. He chose the Army and went to basic training, but this didn't stop his love for music.
I didn't know what was happening. I was so exhausted, Yeah. It was like a, what do you call those things? Nervous breakdown or whatever.
Jimi had serious struggles with alcohol and drugs, which affected his behavior and relationships. Hendrix's name became connected with the drug culture of the 1960s. He experimented with many substances, including LSD, cannabis, and amphetamines. At the height of his career, he was often seen using these drugs, which led to strange and sometimes violent behavior. This wasn't just something he did for fun. He was looking for ways to express his thoughts and visions, often influenced by the effects of these substances.
He told me one day that I had to go with him and try a tab. I said, "What's a tab?" He said, "Man, you know what a tab is." He said, "That's LSD."
His close friends and people around him said that when Hendrix drank, he could become a completely different person. One of his friends, Herbie Worthington, described him as turning into a bastard when he drank too much. Another friend, Sharon Lawrence, said that alcohol would trigger hidden anger in Hendrix, causing him to act out violently. In fact, Hendrix's behavior towards women was sometimes abusive, and many of his relationships were affected by his drinking and drug use.
Jimi had the ability to take LSD, take more than the average person.
One of the most shocking stories happened in 1968 when Hendrix was in Gothenburg, Sweden for a concert. He was very drunk and got into a fight at his hotel. In the heat of the moment, he smashed a window and injured his hand. He was arrested, and though he was later released, the incident was a clear sign of how bad his drinking had gotten. Hendrix's violent behavior didn't stop there. In 1969, he accused his friend, Paul Caruso, of stealing from him and attacked him while under the influence of alcohol and drugs. A few days later, while drinking again, Hendrix hurt his girlfriend, Carmen Barrero, by hitting her with a vodka bottle in a jealous rage. The injury required stitches, and it was just another example of how his addiction problems were affecting the people around him. But it wasn't only his personal life that was affected. In May 1969, while passing through customs at the Toronto airport, Hendrix was caught with drugs in his luggage. He was charged with possession of heroin and hashish, but he insisted that he didn't know the drugs were there. He said a fan had given him a vial of what he thought was legal medication. Eventually, he was acquitted of the charges, but the experience caused him a lot of stress and made him even more aware of how his actions were being watched.
You could say he was setting a new pace in music style. This thing was an early merger where rock and roll and rhythm and blues meet, along with psychedelics.
But behind the fame, things weren't so great. Hendrix had a lot of enemies. His manager was not a trustworthy person, and Hendrix had a history of getting into trouble with dangerous people. In 1969, he was even killed by mafia thugs in New York. Some people came up with the theories that it was Jimi's manager, Michael Jeffrey, who set the kidnapping up so that he could look like a hero and save Jimi. I mean, the thugs took him and demanded his contract from Michael Jeffrey as ransom. A source says that Jimi was high the whole time and didn't even know he'd been kidnapped. The weekend is referred to as the Lost Weekend because Jimi had no idea he had been abducted. With all these, Hendrix believed his life would be short.
Me square in the eyes and said, I won't be here. And I said, what do you won't be here? He says, it's because I won't be in my body, I'll be dead.
In 1969, Hendrix went on a trip to Morocco. During the trip, a clairvoyant did a tarot reading for him. The cards predicted something terrible. The death card came up. Hendrix took this very seriously and told a friend, I'm going to die before I'm 30. Over the next year, he seemed to expect his death, often talking about how much time he had left. He even started counting down the months.
Out of the blue, he said to the reporter, "I doubt I'll live to be 28 years old."
Just 2 days before his death, something strange happened. Hendrix ran into a journalist friend named Sharon Lawrence at a jazz club in Soho, London. He was too drunk to perform with Eric Burdon's band War, which had a show that night. Hendrix told Sharon, "I'm almost gone." This statement was haunting because it was only days before he passed away. The final weeks of Hendrix's life were filled with chaos. He had just performed at the Isle of Wight Festival, where he gave one of his best performances ever, in front of 600,000 fans. But things quickly went downhill. In Sweden, Hendrix was too drunk and forgot songs while performing. His mind seemed scattered and his body weak. Things didn't get better. In Denmark, he had to be helped on stage by his fiancée, Kirsten Nefer, who was a Danish model and actress. Hendrix had a fever and could barely get through 3 songs before he had to leave the stage. His last show was on September 6, 1970, at the open-air Love and Peace Festival in Germany. But it was far from peaceful. A storm had already delayed his performance, and when he finally got on stage, the audience wasn't kind. They booed and jeered him. As if that wasn't enough, the Hells Angels, who were in charge of security, stormed the stage, set it on fire, and shot a roadie in the leg. Hendrix was at the height of his fame, but his life was starting to fall apart. After a tough tour in Europe, Hendrix returned to London and quickly found himself alone. Jimmy wandered through the city. Friends and former lovers saw him looking sickly and tired. He was often seen shopping on King's Road or watching movies at art house cinemas. One of his last public appearances was at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club, where he tried to perform with Burdon's War, but he failed to make a full performance. He also spent time privately, trying to figure out how to break free from his contract with his manager, Mike Jeffrey.
Jeffries was a very strange, slightly shady character that sort of existed on the managerial sort of aspect of rock music. Always walked around in dark glasses with a kind of off-the-shoulder camel hair coat and things, you know, looked a bit like a kind of caricature mafia.
During his final days, Jimmy was mostly with Monica Dannemann, a 25-year-old woman who had been in and out of Jimmy's life. Monica later claimed that she and Jimmy had fallen deeply in love and were planning to get married. However, not everyone believed her. Some say that Monica seemed more like an obsessed fan than a true lover. On September 17, 1970, just hours before he died, things seemed strange between him and his girlfriend, Monica. Some people say she and Hendrix had a rocky relationship that day. Hendrix started talking to the women, and Dannemann didn't like it. At the party, Hendrix was expected to have a good time, but his other girlfriend, Devin Wilson, was also there. And when Dannemann came to pick him up, she was not happy. Devin told her to leave him alone from the window. After that, the next few hours are hard to understand. Different people have told different stories, and the details keep changing. Dannemann said that she and Hendrix went back after the party. She claimed they stayed up late talking, but in some stories she says they were arguing. Hendrix had taken a drug at the party called an amphetamine, which made it hard for him to sleep. He asked Dannemann if she had anything to help him sleep. Dannemann gave him a sleeping pill called Vesparax, which was very strong. She said he took a few of them, but we don't know exactly how many pills he took. A friend of Hendrix's, a folk singer named Buzzy Linhart, said that Hendrix had been awake for days before that and had seen a doctor. The doctor told him to take 3 of his usual sleeping pills, but the Vesparax pills were much stronger, and taking too many could be dangerous.
What they said, they found out that he had taken a few sleeping tablets, and through that he died actually of suffocation.
Dannemann's story about what happened next kept changing over time. Sometimes she said she woke up at 9 a.m., other times at 10:20 a.m., or even closer to 11 a.m. In her most popular version of the story, she found Hendrix asleep in bed when she woke up. She went outside to buy cigarettes. When she came back, she saw that he had vomited and couldn't wake him up. There were differences in the reports from the medical teams who tried to help him. According to the ambulance crew that arrived at his apartment, they found Hendrix unresponsive and his throat blocked by vomit. They tried to save him, but it was too late. The vomit was all dried. He'd been lying there for a long time. There was no heartbeat. He was blue, not breathing, and not responding to light or pain. But another investigation into Hendrix's death raised questions about these reports. In 1993, former police superintendent Dennis Kerr suggested that Hendrix may have still been alive when he got to the hospital. He was taken to a resuscitation room, not directly to the morgue. Some believe he might have even died in the ambulance. Dr. John Bannister, the doctor who treated Hendrix at the hospital, said he thought Hendrix had been dead for hours. He described finding Hendrix covered in red wine. The amount of wine that was over him was just extraordinary, Bannister said in 2009. It was soaked all through his hair and shirt. His lungs and stomach were full of wine. We kept sucking it out, but it just kept coming.
But they had checked afterwards through a post-mortem and they traced no drugs whatsoever otherwise, and neither did they find any needle marks, which you would have if you put heroin in your body.
However, Hendrix's autopsy report told a different story. It showed 400 milliliters of free fluid in his left lung, but there was no mention of wine in his lungs or stomach, and his blood alcohol level was low. The cause of death on his death certificate was listed as inhalation of vomit due to barbiturate intoxication. This confused report, along with all the different stories about what happened, has led to many conspiracy theories, suggesting that Hendrix might have been murdered or targeted. There were people and groups who might have had reasons to harm him. The FBI had a special operation called COINTELPRO, which aimed to take down influential black figures, and Hendrix was under surveillance by the FBI and CIA. He was even listed as one of the most subversive figures in America. This raised questions about whether his death was more than just an accident. One theory comes from Hendrix's brother, Leon. He said that after the 9/11 attacks, people started to view Hendrix as a threat, similar to how they saw Osama bin Laden. Leon thought there were real reasons to believe the government might have seen Hendrix as dangerous. In the 1970s, when the country was filled with fear and paranoia, the government was concerned about people with influence. Hendrix, being a powerful figure in music, was starting to associate with radical groups like the Black Panthers. The government may have seen him as a threat, especially since he had a huge following of mostly white fans. Other theories suggest that organized crime might have been involved in Hendrix's death. In 1975, a woman named Monica Danneman, who was with Hendrix in his final days, claimed that he had been murdered by mobsters. She said he was poisoned and that a powerful group, possibly the mafia, was behind it. Then in 2009, a man named James Tappy Wright, who worked with the Animals band, wrote a book where he claimed that Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, confessed to having him killed. Jeffrey was in serious debt to the mafia and feared Hendrix would leave him, so he allegedly hired hitmen to kill him and collect a life insurance policy worth millions. But some people don't believe this story. Bob Levine, Hendrix's U.S. manager, said Wright made up the story just to sell books. Levine argued that Hendrix was not murdered and that Wright's story was a lie. Another theory about Hendrix's death comes from Sharon Lawrence, a writer who spoke to Danneman in 1996. Lawrence said that Danneman told her she had poured wine into Hendrix's mouth to try and help him when he was choking. But Lawrence believed that Hendrix's death was a suicide, possibly caused by depression or his struggles with drug use. On the other hand, some believe Hendrix's death was simply a tragic accident. Norman, a close friend of Hendrix, thinks the singer accidentally took too many drugs and didn't get the help he needed in time. Norman believes Hendrix wasn't high or drunk, but rather confused and in poor health, and took a double dose of what he thought was a normal amount. The truth is, Hendrix was in a weak state, both physically and mentally, and was exhausted. Even though there were people around him who cared, they didn't do enough to save him. Sadly, Danneman took her own life in 1996, and with her, the truth about Hendrix's final hours may have been lost forever. So what really happened to Jimi Hendrix? Was he murdered by the mafia or the government, or was it just a sad accident? No one will ever know for sure. But what we do know is that Jimi Hendrix's music, his style, and his spirit continue to inspire people all over the world.
I truly believe that Jimmy met music. You know, music as an entity. Jimmy met music, and music said, okay, bang, you are dedicated. You know, you're the one. You know, I love you too.
After his death, Jimmy's earlier recordings were being sold under his name without his permission. These records, which came from his time with producer Ed Chalpin at PPX, often had misleading covers and were mixed differently each time they were released. Hendrix had signed a contract with Chalpin in 1965, and these releases didn't represent his true sound. Hendrix publicly criticized these records, calling them malicious and greatly inferior. He explained that he spent much more time on his music later on, working hours on a single song compared to just an hour at PPX. Despite Hendrix's complaints, these unauthorized albums became a large part of his recorded music, with hundreds of albums being released in various forms. In 1971, some of his unfinished work was released as The Cry of Love, which became very popular. However, the producers were upset because some tracks were also used in other releases, like Rainbow Bridge and War Heroes. Years later, some of this material was re-released with extra tracks that had been left out at the time. After Hendrix's death, his music continued to be sold in various forms. Producer Alan Douglas took over some of the unreleased music, but his efforts were criticized because he added studio musicians to some tracks. In the 1990s, Hendrix's father, Al Hendrix, regained control over his son's music, leading to the creation of the Experience Hendrix LLC. This company worked with major record labels like Sony to release new Hendrix material, starting with the album Valleys of Neptune in 2010. Hendrix's contributions to rock music cannot be overstated. He was the first to use certain guitar effects in mainstream rock and inspired countless musicians after him. His impact on guitar playing, especially his ability to play both rhythm and lead at the same time, is still studied by guitarists worldwide. Many of today's top musicians, including Prince, Kurt Cobain, and Eddie Hazel, have cited Hendrix as a major influence.